6 weeks after the morning I'm about to describe to you, I sat in a glass-walled conference room and watched a board of directors vote, unanimously, to force out the CEO who'd tried to save his company $4 million by firing me a single day too early. I watched the head of HR, who handed me my termination letter, resign before anyone could formally ask her to. And I watched a $340 million acquisition nearly collapse entirely because two people who should have known better decided that reading my employment contract carefully was somebody else's job. None of them ever saw it coming. I did. I'd been waiting for it for 18 months, because I'm the one who wrote the clause that ended their careers. And I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, from the very first moment I knew something was wrong, right up through the 6-figure wire transfer that told me it was finally, actually, over. I knew something was wrong before I even got out of the parking garage. Not a hunch, not a gut feeling you can wave off with coffee and denial. A cold, physical certainty, the kind that sits behind your sternum like a stone. My badge reader beeped green like always, the gate arm lifted like always, and the security guard, Desmond, who has waved me through that garage for 6 years and asked about my dog every single morning, didn't look up from his phone. Desmond always looks up. Desmond calls me boss lady and asks if Biscuit's hip surgery is healing okay. That morning, he stared at his screen like it owed him money, and I felt the first crack form in the floor of my day. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly what I was walking into and exactly how much I had at stake before I tell you how spectacularly it detonated in their faces. Before I go any further, let me tell you a little about who I actually am, because I think it matters for understanding why none of what happened next surprised me quite as much as it probably should have. My name is Elena Voss. At the time all this happened, I was the Chief Financial Officer of Halcyon Dynamics, a healthcare data and analytics company you've probably never heard of unless you work in hospital administration or private equity, which is exactly how the people who run companies like Halcyon prefer it. Quiet money, boring name, 9-figure contracts signed in rooms with no windows. I had been at Halcyon for 11 years. I started as a senior financial analyst, making $61,000 a year, sharing a cubicle wall with a guy who ate tuna at his desk every single day like it was a personality trait. I worked my way up through FP&A, then Treasury, then Corporate Development, and finally, 4 years before any of this happened, I was named CFO. Youngest one the company had ever had. Youngest woman by a mile. I should tell you a little more about those 11 years, actually, because I think it explains something important about why I reacted to my own firing the way I did, with contracts and quiet phone calls instead of tears, with strategy instead of shock. I grew up outside Pittsburgh, the daughter of a single mother who worked as a bookkeeper for 3 different small businesses simultaneously just to keep our lights on, and who used to sit at our kitchen table on Sunday nights with a calculator and a legal pad, reconciling other people's finances by hand because none of the businesses she worked for could afford the software everyone else was using. I did my homework across from her most weekends, and somewhere in there, without either of us really deciding it, I absorbed the idea that numbers were not abstract, that a balance sheet was a story about real people's real lives, and that the people who understood the story best were the ones who couldn't afford to be wrong about it. I put myself through a state school on a mix of scholarships and 2 part-time jobs, and I got my first finance job at a company that no longer exists, doing the kind of entry-level analyst work that mostly involves updating spreadsheets nobody senior reads until the 1 week a year they suddenly need them urgently. I was good at it. I was good at it in the specific, quiet way that doesn't always get noticed right away, because I wasn't the loudest person in the room, and for the first several years of my career, I genuinely believed that being good at your job was enough on its own to get you where you wanted to go. It took a particular incident, about 4 years into my career, to disabuse me of that belief entirely. I'd built a financial model, unglamorous, deeply technical, the kind of thing that takes 80 hours and gets referenced in exactly one board meeting, that ended up identifying a 30% margin leak in one of our largest product lines, caused by a vendor contract nobody had actually reread in 6 years. I presented the findings to my director, a perfectly pleasant, entirely unremarkable man named Greg, who thanked me, told me it was great work, and then presented the exact same findings to the executive committee 2 weeks later, under his own name, with a slide deck that used, almost verbatim, language from my original memo. I didn't say anything at the time. I was 26, I had student loans, and I did not yet have the professional standing to pick that particular fight and expect to win it. But I remember very clearly making a decision in that moment that has shaped every year of my career since. I was never again going to do work valuable enough to get stolen without also building, quietly and deliberately, the kind of documentation and institutional relationships that made stealing it a much riskier proposition for whoever tried. That is, if you want the honest version, the actual origin of everything that happened with Section 14. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition, built over 2 decades of watching again and again in different companies under different bosses, how easily credit and compensation get redirected away from the person who actually did the work, especially when that person is a woman who's been taught her whole professional life that being gracious about it is the price of being allowed to stay in the room. I moved to Halcyon 11 years ago specifically because the woman who hired me, my very first boss there, a CFO named Patricia Alvarez, who has since retired to a vineyard in Oregon and sends me a bottle of wine every December without fail, told me in my final interview, "I don't care if you're the loudest person in the building. I care if you're the one whose numbers I can trust without checking twice." I have tried every year since to be exactly that person. And I've built my entire career on the belief that competence, documented carefully enough, eventually becomes its own form of protection. I was right about that, as it turned out, just not in the way I expected to have to prove it. And 18 months before the morning I'm describing, I had closed the single largest deal in the company's history. Halcyon was being acquired. Not acquiring, being acquired by a much larger healthcare conglomerate called Meridian Group for $340 million. I built that deal, not helped with, not supported. I built it from the first back-of-napkin valuation model I sketched on a legal pad during a red-eye out of Denver, through 11 months of due diligence, through a due diligence data room so big it needed its own project manager, through 2 near collapses when Meridian's finance team got cold feet over our receivables aging, through a final round of negotiations that ran until 2 a.m. on a Thursday because Meridian's general counsel wanted to renegotiate the escrow terms one more time. I got it done. I got it done at a valuation $40 million higher than what our own board had told me to expect, because I refused to let Meridian lowball us on the strength of our enterprise contracts, and because I personally flew to Charlotte 3 separate times to sit across from Meridian's CFO and make him understand exactly what he was buying. I want to spend a minute on that, actually, because I think it matters for you to understand exactly what I built before I tell you how casually someone tried to take it from me. Halcyon's core value wasn't in our balance sheet. It was in the 11-year relationships we'd built with 240 regional hospital systems. Contracts, most of which auto-renewed on terms that got quietly better for us every single year because I'd personally structured the escalation clauses that way, years before anyone was thinking about a sale. Meridian's own initial diligence team, when they first ran the numbers, valued that contract base using a standard churn assumption pulled from public healthcare IT comparables, a churn rate that had nothing to do with the actual observed behavior of our specific client base. I caught it in the second week of diligence. I remember sitting in a windowless conference room in Charlotte at 11 at night, watching Meridian's junior analyst present a valuation model that was underpricing us by roughly $31 million because he'd used the wrong comparable set. And I remember the very specific, very quiet satisfaction of raising my hand and saying, "Can I walk you through our actual 12-year renewal data instead of the industry proxy you're using? Because I think you're about to lowball your own acquisition committee by a number large enough that someone above you is going to ask why." It took me 3 more trips and about 40 additional hours of one-on-one modeling sessions with their finance team to walk that number back up. I did it not because anyone told me to fight that hard. My own board, frankly, would have taken the lower number and been thrilled. But because I had built those relationships with my own hands, one renewal call at a time, over a decade, and I was not going to let a 29-year-old analyst with a stale comparable set erase a decade of relationship equity because it was easier for his model. That is the deal Marcus liked to describe, in board decks and investor calls, using the word we. We identified an attractive strategic partner. We negotiated favorable terms. I let it go, mostly, because that's simply how corporate narratives work. The CEO's name goes on the press release, regardless of whose fingerprints are actually all over the underlying work. I let it go, right up until the moment he decided the person who'd actually built the number he was busy taking credit for was also a line item he could zero out the night before it came due. The deal was scheduled to close in 19 hours. 6 p.m. that evening, actually. I'm rounding for effect, but only barely. And as part of my compensation package, renegotiated the year before specifically to keep me through the transaction, I had a change of control retention bonus of $4,200,000, plus full acceleration of my remaining equity, all of it vesting the moment the deal closed, 19 hours away. If you're new here, this is the part of the video where I tell you that if you like watching overconfident men in expensive suits find out the hard way that arrogance is not a substitute for reading comprehension, go ahead and hit subscribe now. Because what happened over the following 6 weeks is, and I say this with zero exaggeration, one of the most satisfying professional collapses I have ever had a front row seat to. And I had a very, very good seat. So, back to that morning. I walked in through the lobby, and our receptionist, Priya... No, wait. I need to slow down and get the names right. Because there are a lot of people in this story, and I want you to be able to keep track of who's who. Because by the end, you're going to want to remember exactly who did what to whom. Our receptionist's name was Marisol. Sweet woman. Brought her kids' school photos in every September to show anyone who'd look. That morning, Marisol wouldn't make eye contact with me either. 2 people avoiding eye contact in the space of 90 seconds is not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And when you've spent 11 years reading balance sheets for a living, you get very, very good at spotting patterns before anyone explains them to you. My phone buzzed before I'd even reached the elevator bank. An Outlook invite, sent at 7:58 that morning, no advanced conversation, no context. Subject, leadership sync, urgent. Time, 9 a.m. Location, Boardroom, 14th floor. Organizer, Marcus Reyes. No agenda, no attachments, no let's discuss in the body, because there was no body. Just a bare, capitalized, all caps, urgent, sitting in my calendar like a lit fuse. Marcus Reyes was our CEO. He'd been in the role for 2 years, promoted from Chief Revenue Officer after our previous CEO retired. And if I'm being honest with you, and I am going to be brutally honest with you throughout this entire story, because honesty is the only luxury I have left after everything that happened, Marcus was not the reason Halcyon was worth $340 million. I was. My deal was. And Marcus knew it, which I would come to understand was the actual root of everything that followed. I took the long way to my office, not out of fear, strategy. I wanted to walk the floor, see who would meet my eyes, clock the temperature of the room before I let anyone clock mine. 3 people wouldn't look at me. My controller, a sharp, twitchy guy named Felix who normally can't stop talking to me about college football, suddenly found something fascinating on his monitor. A junior analyst I'd hired myself, personally, out of a state school nobody else at the firm wanted to recruit from, ducked into the break room the second she saw me coming. And our head of HR, a woman named Denise Coyle, was standing in the doorway of Marcus's office, with her arms crossed so tightly across her chest that her blazer had started to pucker at the seams. That's when I knew. I didn't panic. I want to be very clear about that because I know how these stories usually go. The wronged executive bursts into tears or screams or has some big dramatic meltdown in a glass-walled conference room while everyone watches through the windows like it's a nature documentary. That's not what happened. But before I tell you what did happen, I need to back up a little further than that morning, because the truth is, I'd felt this coming for months. And I want you to understand exactly how long the fuse on this particular bomb had actually been burning. It started, if I'm being precise about it, about 4 months before any of this, at a dinner Halcyon hosted for a handful of board members and senior leadership at a steakhouse downtown. The kind of place where the wine list doesn't have prices printed on it, because if you have to ask, you're at the wrong table. Marcus had just come back from a conference in Scottsdale, where, apparently, several other CEOs had spent an evening comparing notes on exit multiples and executive comp structures, the way men in that particular tax bracket compare notes on golf handicaps. I remember him leaning across the table toward me, wine glass in hand, in that tone men use when they think they're being charming instead of transparent. "You know," he said, "I was talking to a buddy of mine, ran a healthcare roll-up out of Nashville, sold for about our size. He told me his CFO walked away with almost 9 figures once you counted equity. 9 figures, Elena. For a CFO." He said the word CFO the way some people say assistant, like the size of the number offended him personally on principle, even though it wasn't his money and never would be. "Good for her," I said, because I genuinely didn't think much of it at the time. Executives complain about other executives' payouts the way people complain about the weather, constantly, and to no actual effect. "I'm just saying," Marcus said. "These change of control packages get written years before anyone actually thinks about what they'll cost. Nobody does the math until the wire's already gone out." I should have heard that sentence for what it was. I didn't, not fully. Not that night. I told myself he was just doing what every CEO does in the run-up to a 9-figure exit. Quietly, privately, doing the arithmetic on how much smaller his own slice would look next to everyone else's. I had no idea he was already doing a different kind of arithmetic entirely. One where the answer involved making my slice disappear before it ever had the chance to exist. The second warning sign came about 6 weeks later, And this one I actually did notice, though I still didn't put the full picture together. Denise Coyle requested what she called a routine comp file review for the senior leadership team. Standard enough on its face. HR does these periodically to make sure files are current. Except mine, I later learned, was the only file she personally pulled and reviewed herself instead of delegating to her team. And she spent almost 2 hours in a closed-door meeting with Marcus the same afternoon she finished it. I only know that because my assistant at the time happened to walk past Marcus's office and mentioned in passing that Denise looked stressed today. The kind of throwaway comment you forget about until 6 weeks later when it suddenly means something else entirely. And then there was the night before. The actual, literal night before I was fired. I got a text at 9:47 p.m. from a woman named Cassidy Renner, who ran our investor relations function and who I'd become genuinely close with over the years. The kind of work friend you trust with things you wouldn't say in a meeting. Hey, this is probably nothing, but Denise had me pull comp benchmarking data for a senior finance role today, very last minute, very hush-hush. Didn't say whose, just felt weird. You good? I stared at that text for a long time. I typed back something breezy. Probably nothing. Thanks for the heads up. Because I genuinely did not want to believe what my gut was already telling me. Which is a very human failure, I think. The way we talk ourselves out of the thing we already know is true, simply because believing it means we have to do something about it. I didn't sleep well that night. I want you to know that, because everything I've told you about walking into that office calm, collected, unbothered, that's true. But it wasn't luck, and it wasn't some innate coldness in me. It was 4 months of quiet, accumulating dread that I had finally, the night before, allowed myself to actually feel. And by the time morning came, I had already, somewhere underneath the fear, made peace with the fact that if this was happening, I was not going to let it happen to me passively. So when I walked into that lobby and Desmond didn't look up, and Marisol wouldn't meet my eyes, I wasn't blindsided. I was confirmed. And there is a very specific kind of calm that comes from having something you dreaded finally, actually arrive. Because the waiting is almost always worse than the thing itself. I went into my office, closed the door, and did the single smartest thing I have ever done in my professional life. I opened my locked file drawer, and I pulled out my employment contract. 14 pages, renegotiated 18 months prior when Marcus and our board decided, correctly, that they needed to lock me in through the Meridian transaction with something more compelling than a pat on the back. I had used a lawyer, a good one, a friend from business school who now did nothing but executive comp work, and together we had built in protections most people don't even know exist, buried in language most people never read. I flipped straight to section 14. I want to read you the actual language because it matters, and because I want you to understand exactly what these people signed without understanding what they were signing. In the event that executive's employment is terminated by the company without cause, or executive resigns for good reason, during the period commencing 30 days prior to and ending 30 days following the consummation of a change of control transaction, executive shall be entitled to 1. Immediate acceleration of 100% of all unvested equity awards. 2. A lump sum cash payment equal to 2 times the sum of executive's retention bonus and base salary. And 3. continued healthcare benefits for 18 months. Furthermore, executives' continued employment through closing constitutes a material key employee representation under Section 6.4 of the purchase agreement between the company and acquirer. And any termination of executive without cause during the aforementioned window shall be deemed a material breach of said representation, triggering acquirer's rights under Section 9.2 of the purchase agreement. I ran my finger over the signatures at the bottom. Marcus Reyes, Denise Coyle, as a witness on the HR compliance addendum, and our board chair, a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who had personally initialed every page during the Compensation Committee's review because she took her fiduciary duties more seriously than almost anyone else on that board. It was all still there. My parachute. My insurance policy against exactly the kind of amateur hour ambush I was about to walk into. Here's the part they never understood, and I promise you it becomes very, very important later, so hold on to it. This clause wasn't just about my payout. It was tied directly into the M&A purchase agreement itself. I wasn't just a CFO with a golden parachute. I was, contractually, a key employee whose continued presence through closing was a condition of the deal itself. Firing me 19 hours before closing didn't just cost them my bonus. It put the entire $340 million acquisition in jeopardy. They had no idea. Not one of them. I folded the contract, slid it into my leather portfolio, closed the drawer, and stood up. I straightened my blazer in the small mirror I keep by my office door. Force of habit. My mother always said you should never let anyone see you rattled, even in the 2 seconds before they try to rattle you. And I walked to the boardroom. The blinds were already drawn when I got there. Marcus was seated at the head of the table. Denise sat to his right, with a legal pad in front of her, and on it, in her looping cursive, I could read one word written and underlined 3 times. Documentation. There was no laptop open, no slide deck, no cup of coffee, no bottle of water, nothing that suggested an actual conversation was about to happen. Just 2 people and 1 blank sheet of paper sitting face down in front of Marcus, like a hand of cards he was afraid to show me too early. Elena, Marcus said, with a smile that was trying very hard to be warm and landing somewhere closer to a grimace. Thanks for hopping on such short notice. Of course, I said. Wouldn't miss it. Nobody laughed. Nobody was supposed to. So, Marcus continued, clearing his throat the way people do right before they say something they've rehearsed. I'll get right to it. We're restructuring the finance function ahead of integration, and unfortunately, your role is being eliminated, effective immediately. This decision's been approved by the board. The board. He said it like it carried weight. I happen to know that the board in this context almost certainly meant Marcus and maybe one other compliant board member, because Eleanor Whitfield, our chair, would never in 100 years have signed off on firing me 19 hours before a deal I had personally built was set to close. I filed that thought away too. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I nodded slowly, the way you'd nod if someone told you it might rain later. Understood, I said. Marcus actually blinked. I think he'd rehearsed for a fight and gotten silence instead, and silence is so much more unsettling than a fight, because it means the other person already knows something you don't. I'll need your badge, Denise said, not unkindly, in the same voice HR people use for everything from firing you to informing you the vending machine is out of order. There's one more thing, Marcus added, and I watched him glance at Denise the way a student glances at a classmate before delivering a line he's clearly been coached to say. We'd like you to sign this transition agreement. Standard stuff. Confirms the terms of your departure, non-disparagement, that kind of thing. If you sign today, we can process a modest severance on top of your standard PTO payout. He slid a second document across the table. 2 pages, single-spaced. The kind of document that had clearly been drafted in a hurry by someone who did not do this for a living. Because a real severance agreement runs 8 to 15 pages minimum and covers things like COBRA continuation, equity treatment, and release language with actual specificity. This had none of that. It had a signature line and a number, $50,000, in exchange for a full release of claims. $50,000 to release $8.4 million in contractual obligations I hadn't even mentioned to them yet, because they hadn't asked, and I certainly wasn't going to volunteer it while that document was sitting on the table wearing a bow. I'll want to review this with counsel before I sign anything, I said, pleasant as ever, sliding it back across the table without so much as glancing at the signature line twice. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Not quite panic, not yet, but the first small crack of a man realizing the script he'd rehearsed in the shower that morning wasn't playing out the way he'd imagined it. It's pretty standard language, Elena. We were hoping to keep this simple. I'm sure you were, I said. I'll need your badge, Denise said, not unkindly, in the same voice HR people use for everything from firing you to informing you the vending machine is out of order. I handed it over. I smiled, genuinely, not performatively, because I already knew what was about to happen to both of them, and I said, "Of course." And just like that, on paper, I was no longer the chief financial officer of Halcyon Dynamics. Except that wasn't true. Not yet. Because what Marcus didn't understand, what Denise didn't understand, what not one single person in that room understood, is that firing me 19 hours before a change of control didn't save the company a dime. It detonated Section 14. And Section 14 didn't just mean they owed me $8.4 million instead of $4.2. It meant the entire acquisition, the one Marcus had been telling analysts and reporters and his own golf buddies he had personally delivered, was now sitting on a live wire. They would find that out inside of 48 hours, but first, I had some stops to make. I left the boardroom the way you'd leave a lunch meeting that ran a little long. Calm, unhurried. The termination letter. Because of course there was a termination letter. One single typed page that Denise slid across the table at the last second like she'd almost forgotten the whole point of the meeting, sat folded in my hand like a parking receipt. Marcus stayed seated. Denise didn't walk me out. Nobody from HR trailed behind me to make sure I didn't, key any cars in the parking garage on my way out. They just sat there, the two of them, like mannequins in a discount suit store, waiting for the next scene in a play they thought they were directing. I want to pause here and say something, because I think it matters for anyone watching this who's ever been on the receiving end of a moment like that one. There is a very specific kind of arrogance that infects people the second they think they hold all the power in a room. Marcus had convinced himself that firing me a day early was clever, a loophole, a way to save the company $4 million through nothing more than good timing. What he never understood, what almost nobody who writes these contracts from the other side of the table ever understands, is that the entire point of Section 14 was to make that kind of maneuver not just useless, but catastrophic. You don't build a career the way I built mine without learning, the hard way, more than once, that the people who write the rules always assume the person across the table hasn't read them as carefully as they have. I had read Section 14 more carefully than anyone alive. I wrote half of it myself. Instead of heading for the parking garage, I walked to the executive elevator bank and pressed the button for the 22nd floor. Legal and compliance. I'd spent enough late nights up there during the Meridian negotiation to know exactly which door to knock on. The receptionist up there, a young guy named Theo, barely glanced up from his monitor until I set my portfolio down on his desk with a soft, deliberate thud. "Is Priya in?" I asked. "Do you have a—" "I just got fired," I said, and I smiled. "She'll want to see me." Priya Shah was our assistant general counsel. Sharp as a blade, dry as a Tuesday, and one of maybe 4 people at Halcyon I trusted with my actual, unfiltered opinion about anything. She'd cut her teeth doing M&A at a big firm in New York before deciding she'd rather have a life, and she'd shadowed me constantly during the Meridian deal because she was the one who actually drafted the key employee provisions in the purchase agreement. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from her, and I watched her face do something I will genuinely never forget for the rest of my life. It went from concern to confusion to a kind of dawning, horrified delight that I can only describe as the exact expression of someone watching a very expensive vase fall off a very high shelf in slow motion. "They fired you," she said, not a question. "Effective immediately. No cause cited, no mention of Section 14. "Today?" Her voice cracked slightly on the word. "This morning, 19 hours before close." Priya put both hands flat on her desk like she needed the surface to stay upright. "Elena, do you understand what you just told me?" "I wrote most of it," I said. "I understand exactly what I just told you." She grabbed the contract out of my portfolio and flipped straight to Section 14 like she already knew the page number by heart, which, given that she'd helped draft the corresponding language in the purchase agreement, she probably did. "This isn't just a comp trigger," she said, reading it again, slower this time, her finger tracing the line about key employee representations. "Elena, this is a Section 6.4 rep. Marcus terminating you inside the protection window isn't just a breach of your employment contract. It's a breach of the purchase agreement. Meridian's counsel is going to see this within hours of closing, if closing even happens on schedule now, which—" She stopped herself, pressed her fingers to her temples. "Did Marcus sign off on this language? Personally?" "He initialed every page during the comp committee review. He asked what the multiplier meant. I told him it was to protect against exactly the kind of last-minute maneuvering he apparently thought he was clever enough to pull off anyway." Priya let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "They think firing you voids the obligation. It doesn't void anything. It triggers it. This isn't a loophole. This is a tripwire, and they just walked straight through it wearing clown shoes." "I'm not here for revenge," I told her, and I meant it, at least in that moment. "I'm here to make sure this gets handled correctly and quietly before anyone does something even more stupid trying to cover their tracks." She nodded slowly. "You want this escalated to Meredith?" Meredith Okafor was our general counsel. I'd worked closely with her throughout the Meridian negotiation, and while I respected her enormously, I also knew that once something landed on Meredith's desk, it moved through proper channels at proper channel speed, which is to say, not very fast. "Not yet," I said. "I'd rather it come from you first, quietly, so the people upstairs understand the size of the problem before it becomes a fire drill. And Priya, I want you to loop in Jordan, too." Jordan Kim was a compliance analyst, 26 years old, whom I'd personally pulled out of an internal audit rotation 18 months earlier because she had the sharpest eye for financial irregularities I'd seen in a junior hire in a decade. She idolized me a little, in the way smart 26-year-olds idolize the person who gave them their first real shot. And I was about to give her a front row seat to exactly why that kind of loyalty matters. "You're building a paper trail," Priya said, watching me with something between admiration and wariness. "I already built it," I said, 18 months ago. I'm just making sure the right people can find it. If you're the kind of person who likes watching arrogant men discover in real time that they have badly miscalculated, go ahead and drop a like on this video right now, because we are just getting started. And what happens over the next 6 weeks makes what I've told you so far look like the opening credits. I found Jordan exactly where I expected, hunched over dual monitors in a cubicle 2 sizes too small for the amount of institutional dirt she quietly kept in her head. Jordan remembered everything: vendor names, expense report anomalies, the exact date 11 months earlier that Marcus had tried to expense a $4,200 dinner in Miami as a client relationship development cost for a client who, according to the sign-in logs, had never actually set foot in that restaurant. "Elena?" she said, looking up, already alarmed by my face before I'd said a single word. "I just heard. Is it true?" "It's true," I said, sliding my portfolio onto her desk. "I need you to look at something, and I need you to understand you're not obligated to do anything with it unless you want to." She opened the folder like it might bite her. I watched her eyes move down the page, watched her lips silently form the words, "Key Employee Representation." Watched the exact moment her professional brain caught up to what her gut had already understood. "This is tied to the Meridian Purchase Agreement," she said quietly. "Section 6.4. Priya drafted it. I signed off on the comp language that triggers it. They fired you the day before close." Her voice had gone very flat, the way people's voices go when they're doing math they don't like the answer to. "Elena, this isn't just about your bonus. If this gets in front of Meridian's deal counsel before signing, they could invoke a material breach and walk, or renegotiate the purchase price down, significantly." "I know," I said. "Does Marcus know?" "Marcus doesn't even know what he doesn't know yet. That's rather the point." Jordan sat back in her chair, and I watched something settle into her posture. Resolve. The kind that changes how a person carries themselves for the rest of their life, if they're lucky enough to have that resolve tested this early. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing dramatic," I said. "I need you to make sure that if anyone starts quietly trying to alter timestamps on my termination paperwork, or backdate a performance review that never existed, or manufacture a cause justification after the fact, someone on the inside notices immediately and knows exactly who to call." She nodded, and something in her jaw set in a way I hadn't seen before. "I'll take it to Meredith the second Priya gives me the word." "There's something else," I said, and I watched her brace slightly, the way people do when they sense the conversation is about to get heavier than it already was. "I want you to understand why I'm handing this to you specifically, and not just leaving it entirely to Priya and Meredith to handle from the legal side." "Okay," she said carefully. "Because compliance functions get treated, in most companies, as an afterthought, a cost center, a box to check. Nobody thinks the 26-year-old, 2 years out of her master's program, is the person who's going to catch the thing that actually matters. I built my entire career on the idea that the person paying closest attention in the room is very rarely the person with the loudest title. And I want this handled by someone who's going to look at that metadata timestamp and actually understand what it means, not just skim past it because a VP told her not to worry about it." Jordan was quiet for a moment. "You could have flagged the metadata issue yourself. You clearly already suspected something." "I could have," I agreed. But if I flag it, it's the aggrieved former executive making an accusation, and accusations from aggrieved former executives get discounted automatically, fairly or not, because everyone assumes bias. If you flag it, an internal compliance analyst with no personal stake in my outcome, following standard metadata review procedure, it's simply a fact the company discovered on its own. That distinction is going to matter enormously if this ever goes in front of a judge or a jury, or even just an uncomfortable board meeting. I need this to look exactly like what it is, the system working, not a woman with a grudge. I watched something shift in her expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. The particular look of someone realizing the person in front of them is playing a longer, more careful game than they'd initially given her credit for. That's okay. That's actually kind of brilliant, she said. It's not brilliant, I told her. It's just patient. Most people confuse the two. Good, I said. One more thing, Jordan. This is one of those moments that quietly defines the rest of a career. You can flag this and treat it like someone else's problem. Or you can be the person who saw it first and said something, and let that be the thing people remember about you 5 years from now. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I saw the decision already made in her face. I walked out of that floor and nobody stopped me. Nobody asked where I was going or why the CFO who'd just been eliminated was casually strolling out of legal and compliance with a leather portfolio full of documents nobody upstairs had thought to ask about yet. That's the thing about a quiet exit. Everyone assumes it means you've accepted defeat. I hadn't accepted anything. I was leaving the building rigged, and someone upstairs had just tripped the wire without even knowing it yet. Before I left the building entirely, there was one more encounter I want to tell you about, because it's the one that nearly broke my composure, and composure, at that point, was the only currency I had left. I was waiting for the elevator on the executive floor when the doors opened and a young woman stepped out, Nadia, a new hire in our marketing department, maybe 6 months into her first job out of business school. I'd interviewed her myself, actually, sat in on her final round because Marcus liked to say I had a good read on people, which, in hindsight, is a strange compliment for a man to pay a woman he was quietly planning to discard. Elena, she said, and I could see her doing the math in real time, the way people do when a rumor they'd assumed was exaggerated turns out to be standing right in front of them holding a cardboard box. Is it? I heard something happened, but I figured it was like a rumor. It's not a rumor, I said, keeping my voice light. But you basically are the finance department. Everyone says that. My manager says half our biggest contracts only exist because you personally called the CFOs and got it done. I smiled because there was something almost unbearably sweet about a 25-year-old saying this to me in an elevator lobby on what was, functionally, the worst professional day of my career. And something almost unbearably sad about the fact that she clearly had no idea how little that kind of institutional value protects you from a man who's already decided you're inconvenient. Well, I said, I guess they're about to find out what that actually looks like without me in the building. Are you okay? She asked, and I remember being genuinely touched that this was her first question, not what happened or is this connected to the deal? Just a simple, human, are you okay? From someone who had every reason to be focused entirely on her own career anxiety in that moment instead. I will be, I told her, and I meant it, even though at that exact moment I wasn't entirely sure it was true yet. Do me a favor, Nadia. If anyone asks you what happened, you don't know anything and you're not required to guess. Just do good work and keep your head down for a couple weeks. This is going to get loud, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you." She nodded, wide-eyed, and I stepped into the elevator. And just before the doors closed, on something close to instinct, I added one more sentence. "And Nadia, if anyone from HR tries to get you to say anything about my performance, anything at all, even something small and offhand, you tell them you'd like to speak with your own counsel before answering. You don't work for them. You work for yourself. Everyone in that building would do well to remember that. Starting today." The doors closed on her startled face, and I rode the rest of the way down in silence, letting myself take one single, quiet, shaking breath before I put it away entirely. Because there was still work to do, and grief, I had already decided, was a luxury for after, not during. By the time I got down to the lobby, Marisol was on the phone, and I heard just enough of what she was saying. "No, I don't know. They just told me to lock the visitor system." To know that whatever conversation was happening on the 14th floor had already started to spiral into the kind of low-grade panic that spreads through an office building like a gas leak, invisible until someone lights a match. I didn't go back up. I went home. The first thing I did, before I even changed out of my work clothes, was call my mother. She's retired now, living in the same small house outside Pittsburgh where I grew up, still doing other people's bookkeeping part-time for a couple of long-standing clients because, in her words, idle hands find trouble, and I like knowing where the money is. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, like she's been sitting by the phone waiting for exactly this call her whole life, even though I know for a fact she was probably in the middle of her Tuesday crossword. "They fired you," she said, before I'd gotten out more than, "Mom, it's me," not a question. Mothers who raised you across a kitchen table doing math for a living develop their own kind of instinct for bad news landing on schedule. "How did you—" "Because you only call at 11 in the morning on a workday when something's happened. Tell me." I told her. All of it. Or at least as much of it as I understood in that first hour. The meeting, the clause, Priya's face when she read it, the fact that Marcus and Denise clearly had no idea what they'd just done. She listened without interrupting, which is a rare enough thing from my mother that I always know she's taking something seriously when she does it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said the things she has said to me at almost every major inflection point of my adult life. The same sentence she said the day I got my first job offer out of college, and the day I told her I'd made CFO, and now, this day, the worst professional day of my career. "Be so good they have to notice you," she said. "That's what I always told you. I didn't tell you that so they'd notice and reward you, Elena. I told you that so that when they finally tried something stupid, there'd be a paper trail so long and so clean that noticing you would be the only option left to them." I laughed. Actually laughed for what felt like the first time that entire day, because it was such a precisely, perfectly her thing to say, equal parts tenderness and steel, delivered in the exact tone she used to use correcting my arithmetic homework. "I love you," I told her. "I know," she said. "Now go make them regret it. Properly, not loud. You were never loud, just thorough." I have thought about that phone call more than almost any other single moment in this entire saga, because I think it's the truest explanation for who I actually am, underneath the calm boardroom voice and the folder full of contracts. I am my mother's daughter, and my mother spent 30 years reconciling other people's books by hand because nobody ever gave her the tools to protect herself the way I'd eventually give myself. Every clause I ever negotiated into a contract, every backup copy I ever quietly filed away was, in some sense, a promise I'd made to both of us, that I would never again be the person in the room without the paperwork. Not to sulk, to wait and to work, because contrary to what Marcus apparently believed about me, I was not a woman who was going to spend the next 6 weeks crying into a bottle of overpriced red wine, feeling sorry for myself. I had 11 years of institutional knowledge, a Rolodex, yes, an actual physical Rolodex, laugh all you want, full of relationships with people at Meridian, at our board, at 3 different investment banks who'd tried to poach me over the years, and a very, very clear understanding of exactly how much trouble Marcus Reyes had just bought himself. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that I recognized almost instantly by the punctuation alone. "This is Eleanor Whitfield. Can we speak this afternoon?" No question mark. Eleanor never used question marks in texts, which I'd always found strangely fitting for a woman who ran board meetings like she was defusing a bomb. Calm, deliberate, and absolutely certain that panic never solved anything a clear head couldn't solve faster. I called her back within the minute. "Elena," she said, and I could hear, even through the phone, that she was walking somewhere with purpose, heels clicking against marble. "Tell me what happened this morning. All of it. And tell me it isn't what I think it is." "It's exactly what you think it is," I said. There was a long pause. I heard a door close on her end. "Marcus told the compensation committee last month that your role was being right-sized post-close to reduce redundancy and that he'd handle the transition delicately. He did not tell me he intended to terminate you before close. He did not consult me. He did not consult outside counsel. Did he even read Section 14? He initialed every page of it 18 months ago," I said. Whether he read it is a separate question entirely. Eleanor exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that tells you someone is doing very fast, very unpleasant arithmetic in their head. "I'm calling an emergency session of the compensation committee for this evening. I need you to send Priya everything, every version of the contract, every amendment, every signature page." "She already has it," I said. "She's had it since about 9:45 this morning." Another pause, shorter this time. "You went straight to legal." "I went straight to the people who would understand what I was holding, before anyone had the chance to convince themselves it wasn't real." "Smart," Eleanor said, and I could hear something in her voice that might have been the beginning of a very small, very grim smile. "Elena, I want you to know, this board is going to take this seriously, extremely seriously. Marcus terminating our own key employee representation the night before a $340 million close is not a personnel issue. It's an existential one." "I know," I said. "That's rather the problem for him." That evening, Priya called me from her car in the parking garage of her own building, engine off, because, in her words, "I don't trust the conference rooms tonight, and I definitely don't trust my own office Wi-Fi with how many people are suddenly very interested in what I'm working on." "I want to walk you through exactly what we're going to do over the next 72 hours, she said, "because I need you organized and I need you fast, and I know you're already both of those things, but I want us aligned." We spent almost 2 hours on that call, going through the entire document trail piece by piece. She wanted 3 complete, independently verified copies of the full contract history, the original agreement, every amendment, every signature page with metadata intact, stored in 3 separate locations, none of which touched Halcyon's own systems, in case anyone upstairs got the idea to try tampering with records the way they'd apparently already tried once with the performance improvement plan. I already have 3 copies, I told her. I've had them since the Q4 renegotiation. One with my personal attorney, one in an encrypted drive with a dead man's clause that auto-notifies the board if my employment record is altered without a matching clause tag on the changelog, and one physical copy in a safe deposit box that has nothing to do with anything digital at all. There was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear her exhale. Elena, I need you to understand that most people do not build that kind of redundancy into a job they intend to keep for years. Most people haven't watched what I've watched happen to other people, I said. I built it because I hoped I'd never need it. I built it anyway. Well, Priya said, and I could hear, even through the phone, the particular kind of exhausted, slightly disbelieving respect in her voice. I've been a corporate lawyer for 11 years, and I have never once had a client hand me a folder this clean, this fast, with 0 prompting from me. Usually, I'm the one begging people to save their receipts. Around 8 that evening, right as Priya and I were wrapping up, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Elena, this is Diane Fenwick. I sit on Halcyon's board. I want you to know that what happened today does not represent this board, and several of us intend to make sure it's corrected properly. You don't need to respond to this. I just didn't want you to spend tonight thinking you were alone in this. I read that text 4 or 5 times before I set my phone down. I didn't know Diane well. We'd been in maybe a dozen meetings together over the years, always professional, never particularly warm. The kind of relationship built entirely on competence rather than personal connection. I hadn't expected her, of everyone on that board, to be the first one to reach out personally, unprompted, on the very day it happened, before Eleanor had even convened the emergency session. I've since learned that Diane had her own history with exactly this kind of situation. A previous board seat, years earlier, at a different company, where she'd watched a CEO push out a female COO under suspiciously similar circumstances right before an acquisition closed, and where the board at the time had quietly looked the other way rather than confront it. She told me, much later, over coffee, that she'd promised herself she would never sit silently through that particular pattern again if she ever saw it a second time. I recognized it within about 4 minutes of Eleanor's first update, she told me. The timing, the lack of documentation, the sudden HR involvement with no paper trail. I've seen this exact play run before. I just never got the chance to help stop it the first time. I need to take you inside Halcyon's offices for what happened over the next several hours, because I wasn't there for all of it personally, but between Priya, Jordan, and Hal, much later, a very talkative junior associate at Meridian's outside law firm who had absolutely no idea how much trouble he was creating for himself by telling me any of this, I was able to piece together almost the entire timeline. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most satisfying sequences of dominoes I have ever watched fall. Denise Coyle stormed into the HR conference room a little after 11 that morning, according to Jordan, who happened to be walking past with a stack of files and heard every word through a door that wasn't quite closed all the way. "We need documentation," Denise snapped at a junior HR generalist named Trent, who apparently blinked at her the way you'd blink at someone speaking a language you only half understood. "Something that shows cause. A write-up, a coaching note, anything." "Denise, she's never had a single formal write-up in 11 years, Trent said. "Her file is basically empty except for performance reviews, and every single one of them is a 5 out of 5. "There has to be something," Denise's voice had gone thin and high in the way voices go when the person speaking already knows the answer and is refusing to accept it. She walked out of that room too calm. She's building a case, and legal is already... She stopped herself. Trent, according to Jordan, actually asked, "Legal is already what?" "Nothing," Denise snapped. "Just look." Meanwhile, 2 floors up, Priya had already walked the folder into Meredith Okafor's office, and Meredith, I'm told, read section 14 exactly once, went the color of old newspaper, and picked up her desk phone to call outside counsel before Priya had even finished sitting down. By 1:30 that afternoon, Marcus was pacing his own office with his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, on the phone with Meridian's deal team, trying, and I want you to really sit with the audacity of this, trying to push the closing date back 24 to 48 hours to finalize some internal transition items, without telling Meridian a single word about what those transition items actually were. Meridian's lead negotiator, a woman named Carol Ibarra, whom I had personally spent 11 months building a relationship with, apparently found this request odd enough that she looped in her own outside counsel before agreeing to anything. And outside counsel, doing exactly what outside counsel is paid an obscene hourly rate to do, pulled the purchase agreement back out and reread Section 6.4, the key employee representations. Halcyon represents and warrants that each of the individuals listed on Schedule 6.4A remains employed by the company in good standing as of the closing date, and no such individual has resigned or been terminated other than for cause during the period between the date of this agreement and the closing. Guess whose name was first on Schedule 6.4A? By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Carol Ibarra called Marcus back, and according to what I later heard secondhand from Jordan, who heard it from someone in Marcus's own admin pool, the call did not go well for him. "Marcus," Carol reportedly said, "my counsel is telling me your CFO, the one whose name is on Schedule 6.4, is no longer with the company as of this morning. Is that accurate?" There was, apparently, a very long silence. "It was a restructuring decision," Marcus said. "Unrelated to the transaction. Standard post-close streamlining, just moved up slightly." "Was there cause?" Another silence. "We're restructuring the finance function," Marcus said again, apparently having no better answer the second time than he had the first. "Marcus," Carol said, and I genuinely wish I had been able to hear the tone of her voice with my own ears, because everyone who relayed this part of the story to me later described it the same way: flat, cold, and utterly without patience. That is not an answer to my question, and my counsel is telling me this may constitute a material breach of Section 6.4. We are pausing closing pending review. 19 hours became a hard stop. The deal did not close that evening. I found out it hadn't closed the way most people find out anything important these days, a notification, at 6:14 p.m., not from anyone at Halcyon, but from a financial news alert I'd had set up on Meridian's ticker for 11 months out of pure professional habit. Meridian Group acquisition of healthcare analytics target delayed pending internal review, sources say. No names, no details. Just enough to tell me the wire had, in fact, gone quiet. I sat on my kitchen counter with a cup of tea going cold in front of me and felt the strangest mixture of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also a kind of homesick grief for a deal I had built with my own 2 hands, watching it stall out because a man too proud to read his own contracts had decided my labor was an expense line he could quietly zero out. That grief did not last long, because what happened over the following 72 hours inside Halcyon's walls was, by every account I later pieced together, an absolute masterclass in panic escalating in real time. Inside the building, Wednesday, 8:12 a.m., Marcus called an all-hands meeting for the entire finance and accounting department, ostensibly to reassure the team through the transition. Felix, my old controller, the one who couldn't meet my eyes the morning I was fired, later told me, over drinks 2 months after everything settled, that Marcus stood in front of 40-some finance employees and said, almost verbatim, "There's been some noise about the timeline. I want to be clear the deal is proceeding, and Elena's departure was a planned transition unrelated to any of that." Felix said you could feel the room not believing him, not because anyone knew the specifics yet, but because 40 finance and accounting professionals are, collectively, extremely good at reading a balance sheet, and an unscheduled all-hands the day after your CFO of 11 years vanishes without a goodbye email is not a balance sheet that adds up. Someone, Felix wouldn't tell me who, and I never pushed, asked directly, in front of everyone, "Is Elena's termination connected to the deal delay?" Marcus reportedly said no, in a tone Felix described as the exact tone my dad used when he told me the dog went to live on a farm. Nobody believed him then either. Meanwhile, IT, 11:40 a.m. Our IT director, a quiet, meticulous man named Oscar Delgado, who had exactly zero interest in corporate politics and an enormous amount of interest in doing his job correctly, received a request from Marcus's assistant to pull Elena Voss's full email archive and calendar history, last 18 months, and flag anything related to performance concerns. Oscar, being the kind of person who logs everything because that's simply how his brain works, logged the request, the timestamp, and the requester, per standard IT compliance policy, a policy that exists specifically so that if anyone ever asks who accessed this data and why, there's an answer on file. He had no idea at the time that this single act of quiet, boring diligence would become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. He completed the search. He found nothing usable. He reported that back, factually, without editorializing, the way good IT people do. No disciplinary flags, no performance write-ups, no formal warnings of any kind in the record. According to Jordan, who heard about this exchange secondhand from Oscar himself weeks later, Marcus's assistant relayed the news back to Marcus's office, and approximately 6 hours later, that performance improvement plan, the fabricated one, the one dated to look 6 weeks old but created per its own metadata at 6:47 that very evening, appeared in my personnel file for the first time. Meanwhile, the press, Thursday morning. I want to tell you about the part where Marcus tried to get ahead of the story, because this is the part that genuinely still makes me laugh a little, even now, even having lived through the stress of it in real time. A reporter for a regional business journal, the kind of outlet that covers mid-market M&A closely because it's their entire beat, had picked up the same delayed closing signal I had and reached out to Halcyon's press contact for comment. Instead of saying no comment, which is what literally any competent communications professional would have advised, Marcus, apparently, decided to get on the phone with the reporter himself. I have a copy of the resulting article. I'm not going to name the outlet for obvious reasons, but I want to read you the 2 sentences that ran, because I think about them often. Reached for comment, Halcyon Dynamics CEO Marcus Reyes characterized the transition as planned and unrelated to deal timing, though he declined to elaborate on the departure of the company's longtime CFO. Sources familiar with the matter, however, describe the exit as abrupt and say it has raised questions among Halcyon's acquirer regarding contractual representations tied to key personnel. Sources familiar with the matter. I never found out who talked to that reporter, and honestly, I didn't need to. By Thursday afternoon, the story existed in print, with my name in it, framed in a way that made it unmistakably clear something was rotten, and Marcus had personally handed the reporter the first quote. Meanwhile, the company town hall, Thursday, 4 p.m. By Thursday afternoon, the whispering inside the building had gotten loud enough that Marcus felt compelled to call a full company town hall, every employee, in person or over video, roughly 600 people across 3 offices. I wasn't there, obviously, but I've since watched the recording twice because it was uploaded to the company's internal portal, and Jordan, bless her, saved a copy before Denise's replacement quietly took it down 2 days later. Marcus stood at a podium in an auditorium that had clearly been designed for happier announcements, new client wins, holiday parties, the kind of forced fun corporate theater most of us learn to tolerate, and opened with a version of the same non-answer he'd given the finance team 2 days earlier. I know there's been some noise about a leadership transition and some speculation in the press, he said, gripping the podium with both hands in a way that betrayed more nerves than his voice let on. I want to be direct with all of you. The Meridian transaction remains our top priority, and we are working through some administrative items on the timeline. I don't want anyone spending energy on rumors instead of their actual work. The Q&A portion, submitted via an anonymous internal app, did not go the way he clearly hoped. Question: Is it true Elena Voss was terminated the day before her equity was set to vest? Marcus's face, in the recording, does something very specific in that moment. A kind of practiced neutrality that doesn't quite manage to cover the flash of genuine alarm underneath it. I'm not going to discuss the specifics of any individual's departure or compensation. That's confidential and, frankly, it's the right thing to do for every employee in this room, including her. Question: If the deal doesn't close, does that affect our own retention bonuses? This one, apparently, landed harder, because you could hear the room shift, the particular sound of a few hundred people simultaneously doing the math on their own financial exposure. The deal is not off, Marcus said. I want to be very clear about that. We are working through some items with the Acquirers Council, and I expect resolution soon. Question: Were those items caused by Elena's termination? There was, according to the recording, a full 6 seconds of dead air before Marcus answered that one, which is an eternity in front of 600 people holding phones. I'm not going to speculate on that in this setting, he finally said, which everyone in that auditorium correctly heard as a yes. Jordan told me later that by the time the town hall ended, there were already 3 separate group chats among employees actively speculating about exactly what had happened, with a rough version of the truth, fired the day before vesting, deal now stalled, circulating within the hour. Entirely without my involvement. Entirely because 600 smart people were watching their own CEO fail to construct a convincing lie in real time. Meanwhile, Denise Coyle's kitchen table that same Thursday night. I don't know this part firsthand. I want to be honest about that. This part comes to me secondhand through Priya, who heard it from a mutual contact who was close with Denise's husband. And I'm including it not to be cruel, because by the time I heard it, I genuinely didn't feel triumphant about it. But because I think it matters for the full picture of how badly this decision rippled outward beyond just the people in that boardroom. According to that account, Denise sat at her kitchen table that Thursday night with the untouched dinner her husband had made in front of her, going through the same 4-month-old email thread over and over on her laptop. the one where Marcus had told her to get creative, and she'd hesitated, on the record, in writing, before eventually going along with it anyway. Her husband apparently asked her, at some point that evening, why she hadn't simply refused. Why, if she'd known it was wrong enough to push back on once, in writing, she hadn't pushed back harder, or gone to the board herself, or done literally anything other than eventually comply with a request she had documented her own discomfort with months in advance. I don't know what she said back. I've thought about that question a lot myself, honestly, turning it over from a few different angles, because I think it's the actual, uncomfortable center of this entire story. More than the money, more than the clause, more than the satisfaction of watching Marcus lose his job. Denise wasn't a villain in the way Marcus was. She was something more common, and in some ways more unsettling. A competent, reasonably ethical person who saw the wrong thing clearly, said so once, and then talked herself into doing it anyway, because the person asking outranked her and had told her he'd take the heat. People do that every day, in offices exactly like the one I worked in for 11 years, and most of the time, nobody ever finds the email thread that proves it. That article is the reason, incidentally, that I got the phone call from Cassidy, my investor relations friend, the one who'd texted me the warning the night before, telling me, in a much less careful voice than usual, "Elena, people outside the company are starting to ask questions. This isn't staying quiet." It didn't stay quiet. But I want to be clear. I never once, at any point in this entire saga, spoke to a reporter myself, on or off the record, then or since. I didn't need to. Marcus was doing an extraordinary job of destroying his own credibility entirely without my help, and I have always found it's much more effective to let a man dig his own hole than to hand him a shovel and get your fingerprints on it. If you've made it this far, and you're even a little curious about exactly how much this ended up costing Marcus Reyes personally, not just professionally, personally, in ways he never saw coming, go ahead and subscribe, because we're just getting to the part where things stop being merely embarrassing and start being genuinely catastrophic. I want to be honest with you about something, because I promised you honesty at the start of this, and I intend to keep that promise. When I heard the deal had been paused, I did not feel triumphant. I felt something closer to nausea, actually, because I had spent 11 months of my life building that transaction, and some small, stubborn part of me still cared whether it happened, even after everything. That feeling lasted about 4 hours. It evaporated completely the moment I found out what Marcus tried to do next. Around 6 that evening, according to a time-stamped internal email that would later become Exhibit 14 in a settlement demand letter I still have a framed copy of, Marcus instructed our IT director to restore and review my calendar and email archive going back 18 months, specifically searching for anything he could characterize after the fact as performance issues. There weren't any. I want to be very clear about that. 11 years, and the worst thing anyone could find in my file was a single email from 3 years earlier where I'd pushed back, politely, professionally, with data, on a budget projection Marcus had wanted to present to the board that I felt was overly optimistic. I was right, as it turned out. The actual numbers came in almost exactly where I'd predicted, not where Marcus had wanted them to land. When that search came back empty, Marcus did something so much worse that I still have trouble believing an adult human being with a business degree thought it was a good idea. He asked Denise to draft a backdated performance improvement plan. I only know this because Jordan, doing exactly what compliance analysts are trained to do, noticed a document metadata inconsistency 2 days later while reviewing the personnel file Denise had suddenly, mysteriously populated with a performance improvement plan, allegedly issued to me 6 weeks prior to my termination. The document's creation timestamp, buried in the file properties, the kind of metadata most people don't even know exists, showed it had been created at 6:47 p.m. on the very evening of my termination. Not 6 weeks earlier. 6 hours after Carol Ibarra's phone call. Jordan flagged it to Priya within the hour. Priya flagged it to Meredith the same night. Meredith flagged it to Eleanor before 9 the next morning. And Eleanor, I need you to understand what kind of woman Eleanor Whitfield is, because she is, without question, the reason this entire story ends the way it does. Eleanor did not call Marcus to ask for an explanation. She called an emergency full board meeting for that Thursday, and she instructed outside counsel to attend. And she instructed Meredith to prepare a complete summary of exactly what had happened, exactly what it had cost the company, and exactly who had authorized it. I wasn't in that boardroom. I want to be upfront about that, because I've been telling you this story with a level of detail that might make you think I had a hidden camera in there, and I didn't. What I have is Priya's contemporaneous notes, which she was later asked to produce as part of an internal investigation, and which she shared with me, with her employer's blessing, once the whole thing had resolved and there was no longer any confidentiality reason to withhold them. So what follows is, to the best of my knowledge, close to word for word. Eleanor opened the meeting by placing a single manila folder on the table in front of her, the way you'd place a loaded weapon down carefully so everyone in the room understands exactly what it is. I am going to summarize what has occurred over the past 48 hours, she said. And then I am going to ask Marcus some questions, and I expect direct answers. Marcus, according to Priya, nodded and said nothing, which she described as the first time in 2 years she'd ever seen him not immediately fill a silence with something. On Tuesday morning, Eleanor continued, Marcus terminated Elena Voss, our chief financial officer, without cause, 19 hours prior to the scheduled closing of the Meridian transaction. Ms. Voss's employment contract, which every member of this board's compensation committee reviewed and approved 18 months ago, contains a provision, Section 14, explicitly designed to prevent exactly this kind of maneuver. It further constitutes, per Section 6.4 of the purchase agreement, a material breach of our key employee representations. The head of the compensation committee, a man named Walter Griggs, apparently cleared his throat and asked, Marcus, did you not read Section 14 before terminating her? I was told the termination would save the company $4 million, Marcus said. That was the analysis presented to me. Presented by whom? Eleanor asked. Marcus glanced briefly at Denise, who was sitting 3 seats down looking like she very much wished she were somewhere else entirely. By HR, he said. Denise's face, Priya wrote in her notes, went the color of drywall. I want to be extremely clear about something, Eleanor said, and this is the part of Priya's notes I've read probably 30 times since, because I think it's the single most important sentence spoken in that entire 6-week saga. This board did not authorize the termination of a Schedule 6.4 key employee 19 hours before close. Nobody consulted general counsel. Nobody consulted outside deal counsel, and when the natural consequences of that decision began to surface, instead of coming to this board immediately with the problem, an attempt was made, and I use this word deliberately, to fabricate a backdated performance record to manufacture cause after the fact. Marcus started to speak. Eleanor held up one hand, and according to Priya, he actually stopped talking mid-syllable. Meridian's counsel has now formally notified us, Eleanor continued, that they consider the termination a material breach of Section 6.4, and they have reserved all rights under Section 9.2 of the purchase agreement, which, for anyone who has not had the pleasure of reading it as many times as I have over the past 2 days, includes the right to walk away from this transaction entirely or to renegotiate the purchase price downward to reflect what they characterize as, quote, materially increased execution risk associated with the sudden departure of the company's principal financial architect. The CFO of Meridian, apparently, had used the phrase principal financial architect to describe me in a formal legal notice. I still think about that phrase more than is probably healthy. I want to tell you about the 48 hours where this whole thing very nearly collapsed entirely. Because I think it's important you understand this wasn't a clean, tidy sequence of dominoes falling exactly where I expected. There was a real, genuine window right in the middle of all of it, where the entire deal, and along with it, my settlement, Halcyon's future, and several hundred people's own retention packages nearly came apart completely. It happened on the Friday after that first board meeting, 4 days after my termination. Carol Ibarra called an emergency session, not with Marcus this time, but directly with Eleanor and Meridian's own board sponsor, a managing director named Theodore Sung who, according to Eleanor, had a reputation in the industry for walking away from deals on principle even when the math still worked, simply because he didn't like being lied to. "I'll be direct," Theodore reportedly said, on a call Eleanor later described to me almost word for word, because it had rattled her enough that she'd written down her recollection of it the same night. "My concern isn't the $18 million. We can absorb that. My concern is that your CEO looked our general counsel in the eye, well, on the phone, but you understand, and misrepresented the circumstances of a key employee termination while simultaneously directing his HR department to fabricate documentation. That's not a pricing problem. That's a trust problem. And trust problems don't get solved with a discount." Eleanor told me she felt the floor genuinely tilt underneath her in that moment. Because a trust problem, unlike a pricing problem, doesn't have an obvious number attached to it that makes it go away. Theodore was not threatening to renegotiate. He was, quite seriously considering, whether Meridian should walk from the entire transaction and eat the reputational cost of a failed deal, rather than risk integrating a company whose leadership had just demonstrated, in writing, a willingness to fabricate records under pressure. "Give me 1 week," Eleanor said. 1 week, full transparency, and I will personally walk your team through every single corrective action this board takes, including the removal of anyone responsible. 1 week, Theodore said. "And Eleanor, I want to hear directly from your compliance function, not just your CEO's office, about exactly what happened and exactly how it was caught." That is the reason, incidentally, that Jordan Kim ended up on a video call 4 days later with 2 of Meridian's senior deal counsel, walking them, slide by slide, through exactly how the metadata inconsistency in the fabricated performance improvement plan had been identified. A 26-year-old compliance analyst, 18 months into her career, sitting calmly in front of a room of lawyers twice her age and salary, explaining file creation timestamps with the same unbothered precision she'd shown me the day I handed her my contract. Meridian's counsel later told Priya, informally, over drinks at an industry event months afterward, that Jordan's presentation was the single biggest factor in Theodore's decision to stay in the deal. "She wasn't defensive," he reportedly said. "She wasn't spinning anything. She just showed us exactly how the lie got caught, calmly, like she was walking us through a bank reconciliation. That's not the behavior of a company covering something up. That's the behavior of a company that actually found the rot and cut it out. The deal stayed alive. Barely. But it stayed alive because a 26-year-old I had personally pulled out of an audit rotation 18 months earlier turned out to have exactly the kind of unshakable competence under pressure that no amount of Marcus's charm could have manufactured on his best day. "How much are we talking about?" Walter Griggs asked. "In terms of price impact." Meredith, who had been sitting quietly with a legal pad in front of her the entire meeting, finally spoke. "Preliminary conversations with Meridian's counsel suggest they're going to push for a reduction in the neighborhood of $35 to $40 million, framed as a risk discount, unless we can demonstrate convincingly that the transition will not materially impact integration." The room, according to Priya's notes, went completely silent for what she estimated was close to 10 full seconds. 10 seconds of silence in a room full of highly paid executives is an eternity. $35 million, Walter repeated, very slowly, like he was tasting the number and finding it foul. "To save 4, Eleanor said. There was, according to Priya, another long silence, and then a board member named Diane Fenwick, a retired hospital system executive who rarely spoke up in meetings but was, by every account, one of the sharper minds on that board, asked the question that apparently nobody else had wanted to be the one to ask out loud. "Marcus, was this discussed with legal or the compensation committee at any point before the termination was executed?" "No," Marcus said. "At any point?" "No," he said again, quieter this time. "So you unilaterally terminated a Schedule 6.4 key employee 19 hours before a $340 million closing without consulting a single lawyer on the theory that this would save the company $4 million, Diane said. And Priya noted in her contemporaneous minutes that Diane did not phrase this as a question at all. It was a statement, delivered slowly enough that everyone in the room had time to fully absorb just how bad it sounded out loud. In a room full of people whose fiduciary reputations were now directly tied to the answer. Marcus didn't respond to that one. According to Priya, he just looked down at the table. "I move," Walter Griggs said, "that this board authorize general counsel and outside deal counsel to take whatever steps are necessary to cure the Section 6.4 breach, up to and including full satisfaction of Ms. Voss's Section 14 entitlements, and that we open an independent review into the circumstances of the termination, including the personnel file discrepancy compliance has flagged." The motion passed unanimously. Marcus, Priya noted, voted for it too, apparently having realized somewhere in the previous 20 minutes that voting against his own board's attempt to fix the disaster he'd created would not meaningfully improve his position. There was one more exchange from that meeting Priya wrote down almost verbatim, because she said, when she later showed it to me, that she'd never, in 11 years of practicing corporate law, seen a room turn on someone quite that fast or quite that completely. Denise, apparently sensing the walls closing in around her specifically, tried once more to redirect the blame back toward Marcus alone. "I raised concerns," she said, her voice reportedly cracking on the second word. "I told him, in writing, that there was nothing in her file to justify cause. I said that. It's in the email." "You did," Meredith said. Meredith Okafor, the general counsel, who by that point in the meeting had apparently taken over most of the actual questioning from Eleanor, in the particular clipped, precise tone lawyers use right before they deliver something devastating. "And then, Denise, according to the same email thread, When your CEO told you to get creative, you complied anyway, 4 months later, by creating a document with a false effective date and backdating it into an employee's personnel file. Raising a concern and then acting against that concern anyway isn't mitigation. If anything, it's worse, because it means you knew, in writing, on the record, exactly how wrong it was and did it regardless. Denise, according to Priya's notes, didn't have a response to that. Walter Griggs asked, quietly, whether HR's actions constituted a standalone basis for termination independent of Marcus's, and Meredith said, simply, yes. And that was, functionally, the end of Denise's career at Halcyon, decided in a single, one-syllable answer. Diane Fenwick spoke again near the end of the meeting, and this is the part Priya told me she wished she'd been able to record, because paraphrasing it never quite captured how the room went still while she said it. I want this board to understand something clearly, for the minutes, Diane said. We are not looking at a mistake. We are looking at a documented, months-long plan to deprive a senior executive of compensation she was contractually owed, executed by 2 people this board trusted, using fabricated evidence against an employee whose actual work product is the primary reason this transaction exists at all. If this board treats this as a pricing problem to be quietly settled and forgotten, we will have failed at the single most basic obligation of governance, which is protecting this company from exactly this kind of conduct from the people we've placed in positions of trust. Nobody, according to Priya, said anything for a long moment after that. Then Eleanor called the vote. Here is the part where I need to introduce a twist into this story that I genuinely did not see coming myself. And I promise you, when I tell you what it was, you're going to understand why this entire saga took the turn it did, instead of ending, boringly, with me simply collecting a settlement check and walking away. 2 days after that board meeting, I got a call from Priya, and her voice had a strange quality to it. Not panicked exactly, but careful, in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Elena, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you react. Okay? Denise didn't act alone. On the termination, Marcus gave the order, that part's clear. But the backdated performance improvement plan? That wasn't Denise's idea originally. Jordan found something else in the metadata trail. There's an earlier draft of that document, created 4 months ago. Not 2 days after your termination. 4 months before it. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of it before I fully understood it. 4 months, I repeated. Elena, they were planning this before the deal even reached its final terms. There's an email thread, Marcus and Denise, from back in the spring, where Marcus asks Denise to quietly build a file on you in case, and I'm quoting directly here, we need flexibility on comp obligations once the deal closes. Denise wrote back that your file was clean and there was nothing to build on, and Marcus told her to get creative if it comes to that. I felt something shift in my chest, something that wasn't quite anger, because anger implies surprise, and I wasn't entirely surprised. It was closer to a very cold, very clear confirmation of something I had already half suspected without letting myself fully believe it. He was planning to push me out before close from the very beginning, I said. Not because of restructuring, because he wanted to avoid paying Section 14 at all, and he was building a paper trail to justify it months in advance. That's what it looks like, Priya said quietly. And Elena, this changes everything, legally. This isn't a mistake anymore. A company making a bad faith termination call under pressure, panicking, that's one kind of case. premeditated, months in advance, with a documented intent to manufacture false cause specifically to avoid a contractual obligation, that's not just a breach of contract claim anymore. Depending on how aggressive you want to be, that starts to look like something closer to fraud. I want to tell you that I felt vindicated in that moment. What I actually felt was something quieter and stranger. A kind of grief, honestly, for the 11 years I had spent building something for people who had, apparently, at some point in the spring, decided I was an expense to be engineered out of existence rather than a person who had built the very thing that was about to make several of them enormously wealthy. But grief doesn't pay bills, and it certainly wasn't going to stop me from finishing what Marcus had, with a truly staggering lack of self-awareness, started. "Send me everything," I said. "And Priya, tell Jordan I said thank you. I mean that. Really, thank you." I read that email thread myself later, once it became part of the formal record, and I want to share the exact exchange with you, because I think it tells you everything you need to know about the difference between a company that makes a panicked mistake and a company that engineers one on purpose. From Marcus Reyes to Denise Coyle. Subject: Comp Flexibility. Denise, as we get closer to a potential Meridian deal, I want to make sure we have flexibility on Elena's comp obligations if it comes to that. Her package is going to be enormous once the deal closes. Can you pull her file and see what we've got to work with in case we need cause down the line? Denise's reply came 4 hours later. Marcus, pulled it. Her file is clean. No write-ups, no PIPs, 5 consecutive years of top performance ratings. There's nothing to build a cause case on. If we want flexibility, we'd need to create something. And I'm not comfortable doing that without more direction from you on what flexibility means here. And then, 11 minutes after that, Marcus's response. The one that Priya told me made Meredith physically put her head in her hands the first time she read it. Understood. Let's revisit closer to closing. If it comes down to it, get creative. I'll take the heat, not you. Get creative. I've turned that phrase over in my head more times than I can count in the months since. 2 words, sent casually on an ordinary Tuesday, 4 months before he actually did anything about it. And those 2 words are the reason a straightforward compensation dispute turned into something Meridian's outside counsel, once they saw the thread, formally characterized in a letter to Halcyon's board as evidence of a documented intent to circumvent contractual obligations through the fabrication of performance-based justification, which is a very long, very careful legal way of saying, we caught you trying to lie your way out of paying her, and we caught you planning it months in advance. The next 3 weeks were, from where I sat, a slow-motion demolition, and I watched almost all of it unfold from a comfortable distance because, and I want to be honest about this too, I didn't have to do very much at all anymore. I had built the machine 18 months earlier. All I had to do was let it run. Meridian's counsel, once they got wind, through channels I will not detail because some sources deserve to remain sources, of the fact that the restructuring excuse for my termination had a 4-month-old paper trail suggesting premeditated bad faith specifically designed to evade a contractual payout, did not simply push for a price reduction anymore. They went nuclear. Carol Ibarra called an emergency session with Halcyon's board and, according to Eleanor, who told me about this call herself a few weeks later over coffee, opened with a single sentence. We need to discuss whether this transaction proceeds at all, or whether Meridian pursues damages instead. Losing the deal entirely would have meant no payout for anyone. Not for Marcus, whose own equity was substantially tied to a successful close, not for the rest of the executive team, and not, frankly, for hundreds of employees who'd been counting on their own change of control bonuses. Marcus had gambled the entire company's exit and hundreds of his own employees' financial futures on the theory that firing me a day early would save $4 million nobody was even going to notice missing from a $340 million transaction. Eleanor, to her enormous credit, moved fast. She personally flew to Charlotte. I know this because she called me from the airport lounge, still in her travel clothes, sounding more exhausted than I'd ever heard her, and sat across from Meridian's leadership for 6 hours, offering 3 things in exchange for Meridian staying at the table. Full payment of my Section 14 obligation, immediate, no further disputes. A formal written apology and remediation plan addressing the key employee breach, and this is the part that made my stomach do something complicated when I heard about it. Marcus Reyes' resignation as CEO, effective before closing, so that Meridian's own key employee concerns about executive stability could be addressed by removing the specific executive who had caused the breach in the first place. Meridian agreed, but only after negotiating the purchase price down by $18 million, less than the 35 to 40 they'd originally floated, but still, a very expensive lesson in what happens when you try to save $4 million by breaking a contract you signed yourself. Marcus resigned 3 days later. The official press release used the phrase, "pursuing new opportunities," which is corporate for, "we walked into the elevator personally to make sure he actually left." I want to tell you about one more thing Marcus tried before all of that, because I think it's the single pettiest, most revealing thing he did in this entire saga. And I only found out about it by accident, weeks after the fact, from someone who had absolutely no obligation to tell me, and did anyway because she was furious on my behalf. About a week after my termination, while the board was still deciding what to do about him, while the deal was still technically paused, while he presumably should have had every incentive to keep his head down and behave, Marcus got a call from a recruiter he knew socially, a headhunter named Renata Cole, who specialized in placing senior finance executives at growth-stage healthcare companies. Renata had been quietly approached by one of my old contacts about whether I might be interested in a CFO opening at a company she represented, and, as recruiters do, she called Marcus for an informal reference check because his name was still listed as my most recent supervisor, and she had no idea at that point about any of the underlying drama. According to Renata, who told this story to a mutual friend of ours at an industry mixer months later, apparently not realizing the mutual friend would immediately relay every word back to me, Marcus's reference for me went something like this. Elena's very talented technically, very detail-oriented. I'd just say, off the record, that she can be difficult to manage, territorial about her work, doesn't always play well with leadership direction, and honestly, her departure wasn't entirely voluntary. I wouldn't want to say more than that. Renata, to her enormous credit, found this description strange enough, territorial about her work, being an oddly specific and oddly gendered thing to say about the CFO who had, by every public account, single-handedly built a $340 million acquisition, that she did some digging on her own before passing anything along to her client. It took her about 20 minutes of searching to find the Regional Business Journal article about the delayed Halcyon Meridian closing, and about another 10 minutes on a professional networking site to notice that Marcus Reyes was no longer listed as Halcyon's CEO, despite the reference call happening only a week after my termination. She called her client back and told them, verbatim according to what she later told our mutual friend, I think there's more to this story than the reference suggests, and I'd recommend doing your own due diligence before ruling her out. She did not, notably, ever call me to tell me any of this directly, which I understood completely once I heard the full story, Because recruiters live and die by discretion, and burning a source, even a source behaving this badly, isn't something people in her business do lightly. I only learned about the whole exchange because my mutual friend, 3 drinks into that industry mixer, decided her loyalty to me outweighed her secondhand obligation to Renata's discretion and told me everything, practically vibrating with indignation on my behalf. I want to be honest about how I felt hearing it. Angrier than almost anything else in this entire saga, if I'm being truthful. Angrier than the termination itself. Angrier than the backdated performance improvement plan. There is something uniquely infuriating about a man trying to quietly sabotage your next opportunity, out of what can only be spite at that point. A full week after his own board had already begun dismantling his career over the exact same underlying misconduct, as if the lesson hadn't landed at all. I did not do anything dramatic with that information. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't confront him. I did do one thing, though, which I will admit gave me a very particular, very quiet satisfaction. I mentioned it to Robert Ashworth, my counsel, in an offhand way during one of our regular case update calls, and he mentioned, equally offhandedly, that defamatory reference statements made during an active severance negotiation tend to be the kind of detail that shows up very persuasively in a damages memo, should we ever need one. Marcus's fabricated performance improvement plan already existed in writing. His verbal sabotage now existed in the form of a witness, Renata, who, once formally asked, given the choice between protecting a man who'd tried to use her as a weapon and protecting her own professional integrity, did not hesitate for even a moment to put her recollection of that call in a signed declaration. I never had to use it. The settlement resolved before it became necessary. But I keep a copy of that declaration in the same file where I keep everything else, because I have found, over the years, that the people who try to hurt you quietly, assuming nobody's watching, are very rarely as careful as they think they are. Denise resigned the following week, before the board could formally decide whether to terminate her for cause over the backdated documentation. I heard, secondhand, that her severance package was substantially smaller than it would have been if she'd simply waited to be pushed. I want to tell you about the one meeting I actually did attend in person during all of this. Because up until that point, so much of the story had happened around me, through Priya, through Jordan, through secondhand accounts and forwarded emails, that it had almost started to feel like I was watching my own life unfold as a spectator. This meeting was different. This one I sat at the table for. It happened in a conference room at Priya's outside counsel's offices, neutral ground, the kind of glass and steel high floor with a view specifically designed to remind everyone in the room how expensive the air itself was. Present, me, Priya, a senior partner from the firm handling my claim named Robert Ashworth, and on the other side of the table, Halcyon's outside counsel and, to my genuine surprise, Eleanor herself, who had insisted on attending personally rather than letting the lawyers handle it entirely at arm's length. "I want to start," Eleanor said, before her own lawyers had even opened their folders, "by saying, on behalf of this board, that what happened to you should never have happened. And the way it happened is, frankly, an embarrassment to a company you spent 11 years building. I'm not going to let counsel spend the next 2 hours pretending otherwise." Her own outside counsel, I noticed, did not look thrilled about that opening line. But Eleanor did not strike me as a woman who had ever once cared what a room full of lawyers thought about her candor. Robert Ashworth, my counsel, laid out the claim methodically. The Section 14 breach, the Section 6.4 rep violation, the $18 million purchase price reduction that had already occurred as a direct, documented consequence of the termination, and, delivered with the kind of quiet precision that good litigators use specifically because it lands harder than shouting ever could, the 4-month-old email thread containing the phrase, "Get creative." "We're prepared to demonstrate," Robert said, "that this was not an error in judgment. It was a plan, executed on schedule with a documented paper trail showing premeditation. I don't think I need to explain to anyone at this table what that does to a bad faith termination claim, or what a jury does with the phrase, 'Get creative, I'll take the heat, not you,' read aloud in a courtroom." Halcyon's counsel, a tired-looking man named Preston Yates, glanced at Eleanor before responding, which told me everything I needed to know about who actually held the decision-making authority in that room, regardless of whose name was on the letterhead. "We're not here to litigate the email," Preston said carefully. "We're here to discuss resolution." "Good," Eleanor said, "because I already told this board I have no interest in dragging this into a courtroom for 2 years just to protect a man who no longer works here. Let's talk numbers." They talked numbers for the better part of 4 hours. I mostly listened. There is a very particular kind of satisfaction in sitting silently at a table while a room full of extremely expensive lawyers argue, on your behalf, about exactly how many millions of dollars a company owes you because a man who once implied my compensation package was excessive tried to avoid paying it and got caught doing so in writing. There was a break, about 2 hours in, where the lawyers stepped out to caucus separately, and Eleanor and I ended up alone in the conference room for maybe 10 minutes, just the two of us, looking out at that absurdly expensive view. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "Off the record, not as board chair, just as one person to another?" "Of course." "Did you know, when you renegotiated Section 14 18 months ago, that it might end up mattering exactly like this? Or is that hindsight talking?" I thought about it honestly before I answered, because I owed her an honest answer, and because I'd asked myself some version of that same question more than once over the preceding weeks. I didn't know it would be Marcus, specifically, or that it would happen exactly like this, I said. But I've been doing this long enough to know that anyone who builds something valuable enough eventually becomes a line item somebody else wants to shrink. I didn't write Section 14 because I distrusted Marcus in particular. I wrote it because I've watched this exact dynamic happen to other people at other companies for 20 years. And I decided a long time ago I was done being someone it happened to without a fight built in advance. Eleanor nodded slowly, turning her coffee cup in a small circle on the table. "I wish more people thought that way before they needed to," she said. "Most people only learn that lesson after it's too late to use it." I didn't have a response to that beyond a nod of my own, because there wasn't really anything to add. She was right, and we both knew it. And there was something almost peaceful about sitting in that silence with someone who understood exactly why I'd done what I'd done, instead of having to explain it, yet again, to someone who assumed I must have been either extraordinarily lucky or, worse, somehow manipulative for having protected myself this thoroughly. Meanwhile, on the other side of a wall I couldn't see through, Preston Yates was apparently having a considerably less comfortable conversation with his own client. I only know what happened in that room because Priya heard about it, months later, from a junior associate at Preston's firm who'd been in the room taking notes and who, like most junior associates who've watched something genuinely remarkable happen, could not resist eventually telling someone about it. According to that second-hand account, Preston sat Marcus down in a separate conference room during that same break and, in language considerably blunter than anything he'd used in front of the rest of the table, told him exactly how bad his exposure actually was. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," Preston reportedly said. "The email thread alone is enough to support a bad faith termination claim with punitive exposure. If this goes to litigation instead of settling, and a jury sees the phrase, 'Get creative, I'll take the heat, not you,' next to a fabricated document with a timestamp that contradicts its own claimed date, you are not looking at a company paying a settlement anymore. You are looking at personal liability, because the board is going to have every incentive to argue this was your individual bad faith conduct, outside the scope of your authority, specifically so they aren't the ones holding the bag." "They wouldn't do that," Marcus apparently said. "I'm the CEO. They're supposed to be behind me." "They were behind you," Preston reportedly said, "right up until you handed them a signed confession in email form. At this point, my professional advice is that you resign voluntarily, cooperate fully, and let the company settle this cleanly. Because the alternative path, where this drags into arbitration or litigation and that email becomes public record, ends with you personally exposed and unemployable in this industry for the next decade, possibly longer." The junior associate told Priya that Marcus didn't say anything for almost a full minute after that. When he finally spoke, all he reportedly said was, "I was trying to save the company $4 million. "I know," Preston said. "That's what makes this so remarkable. You are about to cost this company somewhere between $25 and $40 million, plus your own job, plus your own reputation, in service of a decision that saved nobody anything, because the obligation was never actually avoidable to begin with. You just made it more expensive." Before that meeting ever happened, though, there was a formal demand letter, because that's how these things actually work, not straight to a negotiating table, but through a document first. The kind that lands on a general counsel's desk and ruins an entire week before anyone even schedules a call. Robert Ashworth sent it 11 days after my termination, once every piece of documentation had been assembled, verified, and cross-referenced against the purchase agreement itself. I still have a copy. I want to read you a portion of it, because I think the language matters, and because there's a particular kind of satisfaction in watching a threat get made this quietly, this precisely, without a single raised voice anywhere in it. This letter serves as formal notice that Halcyon Dynamics, Inc. has materially breached Section 14 of Ms. Voss's amended employment agreement through her termination without cause during the protected change of control window, and has further breached Section 6.4 of the purchase agreement between the company and Meridian Group through the termination of a designated key employee, absent the required representations remaining true and correct as of closing. Ms. Voss's counsel has additionally obtained documentary evidence in the form of internal electronic correspondence dated approximately 4 months prior to the termination, demonstrating that the company's leadership contemplated the fabrication of retroactive performance documentation specifically to circumvent contractual compensation obligations. Absent prompt and complete resolution of these claims, Ms. Voss reserves all rights to pursue remedies including, but not limited to, breach of contract, breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and claims sounding in fraud with associated punitive exposure. We would prefer to resolve this matter efficiently and without protracted litigation, and we trust the company shares that preference, particularly given the ongoing sensitivity of its pending transaction. Robert told me, when he sent me the final draft for review before it went out, that the last sentence was the one doing the most work in the entire letter. "Every general counsel who reads this," he said, "is going to understand exactly what ongoing sensitivity of its pending transaction means without us having to spell it out any further. We're telling them we know the deal is fragile right now, and we know exactly how to make it more fragile if they don't move quickly. That's not a threat. That's just math, laid out politely." Preston Yates's response came back within 36 hours, considerably faster than the 2 to 3 week response window that's fairly standard for this kind of letter, which told Robert, and by extension me, everything we needed to know about how seriously it had already landed on the other side. By the end of that meeting, the framework was set. Full Section 14 payout calculated off the renegotiated closing price. No further disputes. A formal acknowledgement, in writing though not for public release, that the termination had breached both the employment agreement and the purchase agreement's key employee representations. And Marcus's resignation, which by that point had already been informally agreed to but was, at Eleanor's insistence, written into the settlement terms explicitly, so there could be no quiet walking it back later. If you're the kind of person who enjoys watching consequences arrive on schedule, exactly like a delivery you didn't order but absolutely deserved, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because we are almost to the part where I tell you what actually happened to me, financially and otherwise, and I promise you it is worth the wait. My settlement, once Section 14 was formally triggered and confirmed by outside counsel on both sides, came out to $8,400,000, double the retention bonus, plus the base salary multiplier, plus full equity acceleration calculated at the final negotiated deal price, not the original one, which, because of a technicality in how the equity conversion ratio was structured, actually worked slightly in my favor. Halcyon's board also agreed, separately, to cover 18 months of continued healthcare benefits, as the contract specified, and this part I did not expect, and it remains one of the more meaningful things that came out of this entire ordeal. Eleanor personally pushed through a resolution establishing what the board now internally calls the Voss Protocol, a formal requirement that any termination of a schedule-listed key employee during a pending transaction requires unanimous compensation committee and general counsel sign-off before it can proceed. They named it after me. I did not ask them to. I found out about it from a LinkedIn post 6 weeks later and had to sit down for a minute. I want to tell you what happened to the people involved, because I think you'll want to know, and because there's a version of justice in it that I find more satisfying than the money, honestly, though I'll admit the money was very, very satisfying too. Marcus Reyes has not, as of the time I'm recording this, landed another CEO role. He surfaces occasionally on LinkedIn with vague posts about resilience and the next chapter, the universal signal of a man whose references have quietly stopped returning calls. I heard, through the industry grapevine, that he interviewed for a CFO, not CEO, CFO role at a mid-sized logistics company last year and didn't get past the second round, allegedly because someone on the hiring committee had heard the Halcyon story secondhand and asked one question about it that Marcus apparently couldn't answer cleanly. Denise Coyle, similarly, has not resurfaced in a head of HR role anywhere I can find. Last I heard, she was doing independent HR consulting, which is one of those phrases that can mean anything from thriving small business to a euphemism for between things. And I genuinely don't know which it is in her case. And I'll admit, I don't spend much time wondering. Jordan Kim was promoted to Senior Compliance Manager within 4 months of all this, and Priya, whom I owe more than I can properly express in this video, made partner track counsel at a firm that specifically recruited her because of how she'd handled the entire situation. Quietly, competently, without ever once losing her composure or her ethics under real pressure. I had lunch with both of them last month. Jordan cried a little telling me about the promotion. I did not cry, but it was close. Eleanor Whitfield is still Halcyon's board chair, and she is, without question, one of the finest, most quietly formidable people I have ever worked with. And I told her exactly that the last time we spoke. I asked her once, over that same cup of coffee where she told me about the Charlotte negotiation, why she'd moved so fast, so decisively the very first time I called her. Most board chairs, in my experience, take weeks to decide whether a problem is even real before they act on it at all. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. 20 years ago, she said, I was a VP of finance at a company you've never heard of, and I got pushed out 3 weeks before a liquidity event that would have vested options worth more money than I'd made in the previous decade combined. No contract clause to save me, no Section 14. I didn't have the language back then, so I didn't have the leverage. I got nothing, and I watched 2 men who contributed a fraction of what I did walk away wealthy, and there was not one single thing I could do about it, because I hadn't known to protect myself, and nobody had taught me I needed to. She looked at me directly when she said the next part. When you called me that morning and told me what happened, I didn't need 48 hours to decide whether to believe you. I needed about 4 seconds, because I'd lived the version of this story where the woman doesn't have the paperwork. You had the paperwork. I was not going to let that be wasted twice in one lifetime. I don't think I've ever been more grateful for anyone's 40 years of professional scar tissue in my life. I want to tell you what happened in the year since, because I think the epilogue matters just as much as the collapse itself, and because I've had enough people ask me, in the months since pieces of this story started quietly circulating through industry back channels, what actually happens after the settlement check clears. The Voss Protocol, as the board ended up calling it, didn't stay contained to Halcyon for long. Eleanor mentioned it, almost in passing, at a private governance roundtable she attends twice a year with other board chairs across the healthcare and tech sectors. And within a few months, I started fielding calls, carefully, always through Priya first, always with appropriate confidentiality boundaries respected, from general counsels at 3 other companies asking, essentially, can you help us understand how to write our key employee provisions so this specific failure mode can't happen to us? I've since done a small amount of paid advisory work in exactly that niche, reviewing change of control language for companies heading into their own acquisitions, which is a strange and slightly surreal way to have built a second, smaller career directly out of the worst professional week of my life. I also got a call, about 8 months after everything settled, from a producer at a business podcast with a fairly large following in the finance and executive world, asking if I'd come on to talk about navigating hostile terminations during M&A. I said no, at first, because the NDA restricts what I can actually say, and because I wasn't sure I wanted my real name attached to any version of this story circulating publicly. I eventually agreed to a heavily anonymized version, different names, different industry. Enough details changed that Halcyon's actual lawyers reviewed the transcript before it aired and signed off on it. And I still get messages, occasionally, from other executives, mostly women, who heard that episode and wrote in to ask some version of the same question. How do I know if my own contract actually protects me, or if I've just been trusting that it does without ever really checking? I always tell them the same thing. Read it. Actually read it. All of it. Especially the parts your lawyer summarized for you in a 5-minute phone call 3 years ago that you've never looked at since. Ask what happens if you're terminated without cause during a transaction. Ask what cause is actually defined as, in writing, and whether that definition could be stretched to fit a fabricated performance record if someone decided they needed it to. Most people don't ask, because asking feels paranoid or ungrateful, or like you're already assuming the worst about people who are, in that exact moment, telling you how much they value you. I used to think that instinct, the quiet, persistent unwillingness to simply trust, made me a little bit cynical. I don't think that anymore. I think it made me the only person in that boardroom who actually understood the value of what she'd built, precisely enough to make sure nobody could take it from her without a very, very expensive fight. There's one message out of the dozens I've received since a quiet, careful version of this story started circulating that I still think about more than any other. It came from a woman named Yolanda, a VP of finance at a mid-sized manufacturing company, maybe 8 months ago. And I'm going to paraphrase it rather than quote it directly, both because I want to protect her privacy and because, frankly, I no longer remember the exact wording, only the shape of what it did to me reading it. She wrote that her company was 6 weeks from closing its own acquisition, that she'd been quietly hearing rumblings that her role might be restructured post-close, and that after listening to the anonymized podcast episode, she'd gone back and actually read her own change of control agreement in full for the first time in 3 years. She found a gap. Not a clause that protected her, the opposite. She found language that explicitly allowed the acquiring company to terminate any officer without triggering acceleration, so long as the termination occurred more than 5 business days prior to closing, and her own company's leadership team knew the closing date. And she strongly suspected, having now actually read the document with fresh eyes, that someone did too. I spent about 90 minutes on the phone with her, not as a lawyer, because I'm not one, but as someone who had lived through almost the exact shape of what she was describing. I walked her through what questions to ask her own counsel, what documentation to start quietly preserving, what conversations to have, and, more importantly, which conversations not to have yet, until she had her own paperwork in order. She emailed me 3 months later. Her role survived the transition intact in the end, whether because someone genuinely never intended to push her out, or because word had somehow reached leadership that she'd already retained outside counsel to review her position. I genuinely don't know, and neither does she. But she wrote one line in that follow-up email that I've thought about more than almost anything else that's happened since the settlement cleared. I don't know if anything would have actually happened to me, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of the question anymore. That's worth more than I can explain. That's the actual reason I keep talking about this, carefully, anonymously, within the bounds of what my own NDA allows. Not for the satisfaction of watching Marcus's career quietly implode, though I won't pretend that wasn't satisfying. It's for Yolanda, and for whoever's reading this, and recognizing some small piece of their own contract, their own quiet unease, their own gut feeling that something might be off long before anyone hands them a folded piece of paper across a conference table. And me? I want to walk you through what happened to me in those 4 months I took off, because I think it matters. And because I don't want you to walk away from this story thinking the ending was as simple as a wire transfer landing in my account and a rooftop toast. It wasn't. The money was real, and it mattered, and I'm not going to pretend false modesty about that. $8,400,000 changes the entire shape of a person's life. The questions they no longer have to ask themselves at 3 in the morning. The choices that become choices instead of necessities. But the 4 months in between were strange in ways I didn't expect. For the first few weeks, I genuinely didn't know what to do with myself. 11 years of waking up at 5:40 a.m. to check overnight market data doesn't just switch off because your employment contract terminates. I'd catch myself reaching for my laptop before I remembered there was no earnings call to model, no board deck to review, no Meridian counterpart to call back. I went to therapy for the first time in my adult life, which I'm not embarrassed to tell you because I think there's a strange kind of grief that comes with being right about something terrible. You don't get to just feel vindicated. You also have to sit with the fact that people you trusted, people you'd mentored and worked alongside for years, had decided, in writing, months in advance, that erasing you was worth getting creative over. I heard from people during that time I hadn't expected to hear from. Felix, my old controller, sent a long, rambling, half-apologetic email about 6 weeks after everything became public knowledge inside the company, admitting he'd known something was off that morning and hadn't said anything because he was scared for his own job. I told him I understood, and I meant it, mostly. Fear makes people do smaller versions of themselves than they'd like to be, and I've made my peace with the fact that not everyone gets to be brave on someone else's timeline. I also got a call, entirely out of nowhere, from David Halpern, a managing partner at a growth equity firm I'd crossed paths with twice during the Meridian deal. Once on a call where he'd represented a competing bidder who ultimately didn't win, and once at an industry conference where we'd spent maybe 15 minutes total talking shop over bad conference coffee. I did not expect him to remember my name, let alone track down my personal number. "I heard what happened," he said, with no preamble at all. "I want to be careful here, because I don't want to sound like I'm circling a wounded animal. But I've been telling my partners for 2 years, we need someone exactly like you. And now apparently you're available, and I'd be an idiot not to call." I laughed, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in weeks. "That's a hell of an opening line." "I've got worse ones," he said. "Can I buy you a coffee?" That coffee turned into 3 more conversations over the following month, and then into an offer that looked nothing like anything I'd ever been offered before. Not a salaried executive role reporting up to someone else's board, but an operating partner seat, with Carrie, with real ownership in the outcomes I helped create, working across a portfolio of companies instead of being tethered to just one board's whims and one CEO's insecurities. I want to be honest. It was not the only offer on the table. 2 other firms reached out within that same stretch. One of them a direct competitor of Meridian's that had, apparently, heard the entire story through industry back channels and wanted to hire the CFO who'd taken down a CEO with a single contract clause, which is not exactly how I'd describe what happened, but I understood the appeal of the shorthand. I took David's offer. Partly because the structure genuinely was the best fit for the kind of work I wanted to be doing at this stage of my career, and partly, if I'm honest, because of something small he said near the end of our 3rd conversation, almost as an aside. "For what it's worth," he'd said, "the way you handled this, quietly, methodically, letting the facts do the damage instead of making noise, that's not luck. That's exactly the instinct I want sitting across the table from a founder who's panicking during a crisis. I don't need someone who gets loud. I need someone who already knows where the paperwork is." I think about that sentence a lot. I think it's the truest thing anyone said to me during the entire ordeal. There's one last character I haven't told you about yet, and I've saved him for the end on purpose, because his story is the smallest one here, but it's the one that made me laugh the hardest when I finally heard the full version of it. His name was Grant Aldis, and he was Halcyon's chief revenue officer, a perfectly competent salesman who had spent about 2 years quietly positioning himself as my rival in the low-grade, passive-aggressive way ambitious people sometimes do when they've decided someone else is standing between them and a title they want. Grant never said anything openly hostile to my face. He was too smart for that. But he had a habit, in leadership meetings, of gently undercutting my financial projections with phrases like, "I just want to make sure we're not being overly conservative," which is corporate for, "I think the CFO is too cautious and I'd like everyone to remember I said so." And he had made no secret over drinks at company events of the fact that he thought the CFO role should eventually report to revenue rather than sit as an equal function beside it. The moment I was terminated, according to Felix, Grant wasted no time. Within 24 hours, he'd scheduled a private meeting with Marcus to discuss interim finance leadership continuity, which is corporate for, "Please give me her job." He apparently walked into that meeting with a slide deck, an actual slide deck, prepared overnight, outlining his own qualifications to serve as interim CFO through the remainder of the Meridian close. Marcus, to Grant's evident surprise, did not take the meeting well. Whatever panic had already been building in Marcus by that point over the deal delay, the last thing he wanted, apparently, was one of his own executives circling my job before the ink on my termination paperwork was even dry, especially once whispers about the key employee breach started spreading. Felix told me Marcus reportedly cut Grant off mid-presentation and said, with what Felix described as visible irritation, "This is not the time, Grant. We have bigger problems than your org chart." Grant's ambition, it turned out, had extraordinarily bad timing. By the time the board's emergency review was underway 2 days later, who gets Elena's job was very much not the question anyone was asking anymore. The question was, how much is this going to cost us, and who's going to lose their job over it? And Grant's presence at that particular moment, angling for a promotion while the building was quite literally on fire, apparently did not go unnoticed by Eleanor, who mentioned to Priya, in an aside during one of their calls, that she found Grant's timing instructive as to his judgment. Grant did not get the interim CFO role. That went, on a temporary basis, to a well-respected outside consultant the board brought in specifically because they wanted someone with zero internal politics attached to them steering the finance function through the crisis. Grant left the company entirely about 5 months later for what his LinkedIn described as a new challenge at a considerably smaller company. And I'll admit, I felt something close to genuine amusement rather than any real animosity when I heard about it, because Grant's downfall wasn't really about me at all. He simply revealed, at the worst possible moment, exactly the kind of self-interested opportunism that Marcus and Denise had already demonstrated at a much larger scale. And the board, having just been burned once, was in absolutely no mood to reward a second version of the same instinct. I'm sitting on a rooftop terrace in Austin as I finish telling you this story, if you want to know the truth, with the kind of skyline view that makes you understand why people move here for the ambition alone. Cranes and glass towers, all competing to outshine each other like it's a beauty pageant made of steel. I didn't take another CFO role right away. I took 4 months off, which I had genuinely never done in my entire adult working life. And then I joined a growth equity firm as an operating partner. Not an employee anymore, a partner, with a seat at the table and a carry structure instead of a salary, which is a very different kind of security than anything I'd ever had before. They recruited me, if you're curious, because one of their managing directors had heard, through his own industry grapevine, about the CFO who took down a CEO with a single contract clause. And apparently that story had traveled a lot further and a lot faster than I ever realized while I was living inside it. My phone buzzed a few minutes ago. A settlement confirmation, the final wire, the actual number landing in my account rather than just existing as a promise on a page. $8,400,000 and $0 owed back, and a signed NDA I'm required to keep, which is why I've changed every name in this story and altered enough identifying details that if you went looking for Halcyon Dynamics or Meridian Group, you would not find them. Because those aren't their real names, and this isn't, technically, exactly what happened, though it is, in every way that actually matters, precisely what happened. I scrolled back through my old texts until I found the last number I'd saved from my Halcyon days. Eleanor's. I typed one line, section 14, line 1, no caption, no emoji, just the reference to the exact clause I'd spent a hospital stay 18 months earlier fighting to get exactly right. I'm not exaggerating that part, by the way. I really did negotiate the final language for that clause over the phone from a hospital bed during a bout of pneumonia that had me on IV antibiotics for 4 days, because I genuinely believed, even then, that I might need it someday. And I was right. I hit send, took a sip of my drink, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I felt something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite relief. It was closer to clarity. I hadn't burned the bridge on my way out. I'd walked away from it holding the deed, sold the land underneath it, and sent the people who'd tried to push me off it an invoice for the ashes. I think about Halcyon sometimes, still. More than I probably should for a company I no longer have any legal or financial connection to. I checked a few months ago, out of nothing but idle curiosity, and the acquisition did eventually close at the renegotiated price, and by every public account, integration has gone reasonably smoothly under the new leadership team the board brought in after Marcus's departure. I don't wish the company itself any ill will. I built too much of it with my own 2 hands to want to see it fail out of spite. I heard, through Felix, who still works there and still sends me a Christmas card every year with a slightly too detailed update on the Office Fantasy Football League, that the new CFO, the interim consultant the board eventually made permanent, a quiet, meticulous woman named Priscilla Way, who apparently reads every single line of every contract she's handed before she signs off on anything, has already implemented 3 separate rounds of additional key employee protections across the senior leadership team, unprompted, without anyone having to ask her twice. Apparently, she keeps a framed printout of Section 14 on the wall of her office, not as a trophy, Felix says, but as what she reportedly describes to new hires as a reminder of what happens when leadership assumes nobody's reading the fine print as carefully as they should be. I like to think some small part of that is mine, even though I've never met her and never will, and have no legal claim whatsoever to anything that happens inside those walls anymore. I built something that outlasted the people who tried to take it from me, and it turned into a lesson the entire company now carries forward without my name attached to it at all. I've decided, after a lot of thought, that this is actually the better outcome. Not a statue, not a headline, just a framed page on someone else's wall, quietly making sure the next Elena never has to fight this fight the way I did. I wished, and still wish, only that the 2 specific people who decided my labor was disposable the moment it became inconvenient to pay for had understood, even a little sooner, exactly what kind of woman they were dealing with. They didn't. And that, more than the $8,400,000, more than the rooftop view, more than any of it, is the actual ending of this story. Not that I won. Winning implies luck or circumstance or a fight I wasn't sure I'd survive. I built the outcome 18 months before anyone else in that building even knew there was a fight coming. I just had to wait, calmly, for them to walk into it themselves. They always do. That's the thing nobody tells you about people like Marcus. The ones who mistake charisma for competence and confidence for preparation. They don't get caught because someone outsmarts them in the moment. They get caught because somebody, somewhere, long before the moment ever arrives, was patient enough and thorough enough and tired enough of watching this exact story happen to other people to make sure the paperwork was already sitting there, waiting the whole time. Read your contracts. All of them. Every clause. Especially the boring ones nobody bothers to explain to you in the 10-minute call before you sign. You never know which sentence is going to be the one that saves you. If you enjoyed this one, you know what to do. Subscribe, drop a comment telling me which part made your jaw drop the hardest, and I promise you, the next story is even worse for the people on the other side of the table. Some people never learn to read the fine print. I made a career out of writing it. See you in the next one.